Hi, I'm Daniela Mellen. Thanks for joining me today. Now today's video is a little different than most of my videos. It's not project-based. Instead, I'm going to show you my 3 go-to stitches when I'm slow stitching that I use to make circles and arcs. Now I use these 3 stitches amongst others and amongst other different ways to make circles or rounded shapes. But these 3 seem to be my go-to stitches. They're easy stitches that can be used for any size circle or arc that you make. A quick little tip is the smaller the circle, the smaller the stitches you should use to get that beautiful seamless arc. So the 3 stitches that I use as my go-tos are the back stitch, which is a very basic stitch that can be made into straight lines just as easily as it's made into curves. The next stitch that I use is the stem stitch. And even though that's not a complicated stitch, it looks gorgeous. It's kind of a twisted rope looking result, and particularly on a curved line, it's very beautiful. I think it's a very elegant stitch. And the last stitch that I'm going to show is the split stitch. And again, it's another simple stitch that looks far more complicated than it is. And it looks like a braid when you're done. And so it's kind of interesting, and it looks particularly good with a thicker thread or all 6 threads of embroidery floss. So let's get started right away with my 3 go-to stitches. So the first stitch that I like to do when I make curves and circles is the back stitch. And it's this simple stitch where there's just a teeny bit of space in between each of your stitches. And it creates an interesting effect where it looks like it's a single piece here, a closed shape. So the simple way to do the back stitch if you're doing a straight line is to make your first stitch. You can do whatever length you'd like. I'm just pulling up my thread through my fabric and making my stitch line, pulling it snug, and then I'm going in front of that stitch approximately the same length as the stitch that I already made, pulling it up and then bringing it right in front of that stitch. And I can continue this as long as I want. And if I do it in a straight line, this is the result I get. Now this lends itself to curves very well. Because the stitches are so close together, you'll get a beautiful curve. The smaller the curve and the tighter the curve, the smaller your stitches, and that's just something to remember. So to start that for my circle, I'll just choose my point, pull up my thread, and create my first stitch, and then I'll just go a stitch length ahead of that stitch. I like to trace out my circles with marker that I can remove. Pull my stitch and bring it down, stopping my stitch just in front of that first stitch. And I can continue this all the way around. I stay right on the line and really work on bringing my stitch right back in front of that previous stitch. Now I have a little more control this way because I can really place that stitch exactly where I want it. Now to finish off my stitch, I just poke my hole close to that first stitch that I made, and then I make that final stitch, and that closes my shape. Now on the back, this is what it looks like, and it's just skipped a stitch on my first stitch. I'll pull my needle through a stitch, loop it, and then just snip that. So that's the first way that I can create a closed shape. Now you can see any errors that I made, and by errors I mean varying the length of the stitch. If this was important to the project, I would have to just be very cautious about the stitch length. This is essentially a dashed stitch with very little space in between the stitching. And so it produces a very interesting and beautiful circle. So now the second stitch that I like to use to create a circle is the stem stitch. And this is this stitch here, and I've done it repeatedly with various thicknesses of threads. And what you see is a beautiful, almost rope-like stroke. And it creates a beautiful circle with an interesting texture all its own. So that's another one that I like to use. So to create the stem stitch, I'll start in the same way where I make my initial stitch. And instead of pulling it all the way down and through, I like to leave a little loop. And I always keep that loop on the same side, either the top or the bottom whenever I start my project. So I'm going to keep it all on the top today. I'll put my needle in between that loop, that stitch, and pull it gently snug. And then I'll make another stitch the length of from where I'm starting to a little bit out here, the same length of that first stitch. Again, I leave that little loop, I pull it to the top, and I can continue my stitch by feeding that needle in between the length of that stitch. And by pulling it snug, I get this beautiful rope-like effect. And that is very effective for making a circle or any type of curve. So to start that, I'll come on my printed circle here, choose the length of my stitch, and because there's not really a top or bottom, I like to use outside or inside for my loop. I'll create my first stitch, and then I'll just keep my loop to the outside. So I just hold that loop to the outside so I can make my stitch. I divide my stitch in half, pull up my loop, pull my thread to the outside again, and continue all the way around that circle. And the result is a very interesting rope-like cording of a stitch, and it creates another beautiful closed shape. Then when I get to my last thread where I want to finish it off, I'll just pull it snug and just go behind that stitch, and it kind of seamlessly creates that circle. So there we have the stem stitch on the front, and let's see, the back is quite nice and it looks just like a little straight stitch all the way around. So once again, I'll knot off my thread. So there I have two different stitches creating those beautiful closed shapes. We have one more stitch to go. So now to look at the split stitch here. This is this stitch here, which almost looks like it's braided. This works better with thicker threads, or if you're using embroidery floss, multiple threads. So I'm once again using all 6 threads on this embroidery floss piece. I did run it through wax, through beeswax, to help cut down on the snags and knots in the thread. Now to create the split stitch, what you do is you create your first stitch, again any length that you like, and you want to pull it snug but not too tight. And then you want to take your needle and poke it halfway through your stitch, coming up in between your existing threads. So there's a lot of area for a lot of chance for it to knot, but you still want to continue this way. You pull your next thread down, again snug, and then you're going to come up with your needle, splitting your threads. This not only anchors your threading and your stitches, but it produces that interesting braided-like texture. And once again, this makes a beautiful circular stitch and angle. So now you'll start just like you started with the other ones. You determine the size stitch that you want. I make my first stitch, pull it snug but not too tight, and then I come up, splitting my stitch, and then I just create that next stitch. And I continue this all the way around, making my stitch, coming up with my needle. I want to make sure I split that stitch, pull it snug, and continue all the way around. And now with the final stitch, I come up, splitting my stitch, and I just go a little ways into that first stitch that I put down, and that's how I close the shape. So there we have the 3 stitches, the back stitch, the stem stitch, and the split stitch, creating 3 closed circles with different effects, and they're very intriguing. And once again, we'll take a look at the back of our stitching. I'll knot off my thread, and then we could take another look at our slow stitch circles using 3 different stitches to different results. And these are my go-to stitches when I want to make arcs or circles in my work. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you found these 3 stitches helpful. Now there are plenty of stitches you can use to make circles, but these tend to be my 3 go-to. I'll do others for different reasons, but these are ones that I've easily memorized and produce very different results, from basic to elegant and very highly textured. Thanks for joining me.